So next one I'm going to talk about is backend latency improvements. So a couple weeks ago, I realized that the changes for the WSGI server wrapper were that, among other things, were causing this like intermittent, like 15 to 20-second delay in some requests. There were a variety of improvements made, one of which was to really scale up the number of workers that backend service uses. And this is at the application level, not at the infrastructure level, just to be clear. So this is not an increase.
So what that means?
It just means that we're not spinning up any more pieces of hardware when we're doing that worker. The hardware would be additional cost to us, right, when we're scaling things up. These are workers at the application level, which means it's at the software level. So these are just like making use of unused pieces of the hardware that were not being used before, essentially, right?
And what does workers mean in this context?
A worker is kind of like, think of it like a parallel process. So if you have like one piece of hardware, they're, big enough to handle many parallel processes at once. So this is kind of giving the application the ability to make use of all of that parallel processing, which we were not doing before. We were defaulting to just that one worker. So it's just kind of making the application a little bit more scalable in general.
Right.
So it can handle more requests simultaneously. So that was one of the big changes that was made. The other one was to improve a lot of the indexing in the database. So this is another thing that I went through and did for a few different tables. And that seemed to help as well. So this was just a lot of improvements in different pieces of the system in general. And I think it got the average latency time down from like well over a second down to around like 130 milliseconds, I think was the time after the fact. So big improvements there. It's by no means finished. There are still some intermittent latency coming from various other systems, one of which was like Hugging Face this weekend. I think I mentioned that our Hugging Face instance was throwing 400 errors, 500 errors, which then shows up as latency to the end user. So still some work to be done, but also big improvements here.
Can you share, just give a little context on Hugging Face?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, so Hugging Face as a company is basically started as a website where you can actually share machine learning models with other people. So these are like open source models, kind of an online repository for these models. And one of the features they have is you can take those models, deploy them to, say, an API endpoint, and then access it that way rather than having to like deploy it yourself. And so we use what's called an embedding model. An embedding model takes text and turns it into numbers that we can use to then look up content. So what we have with Hugging Face is they've deployed an endpoint for us on AWS's system to get predictions from that embedding model. The problem with it is, number one, it's like a fully managed service, which means that we have very little control over it. So when something goes wrong, the only thing that we really have control over doing is scaling it up and down. And even debugging, you can only ever see the last 500 log lines ever. And 500 lines goes through in like a few minutes. So you can only ever see the last like couple minutes of history, which makes root causing a problem like what's going on with Hugging Face very difficult if it's not like currently ongoing. So there's a couple methods, like I would love to get off of this Hugging Face endpoint if possible, but the options of doing that are, regardless of what we choose, kind of costly from a time perspective. So there's some conversations need to be had. I think we are stuck with it for the time being, but eventually would be great to come up with a solution. And I did speak with Alex about this actually yesterday as well, and kind of gave him the same spiel that I'm giving you guys now.